There is much more to Aztec history than meets the modern eye, including the name they're commonly known by. They referred to themselves as the Mexica, while the term Aztec referred to their mystical place of origin, Aztlan, and all the tribes who lived there. Once they embarked on their fateful wanderings south, Huitzilopochtli told them they would henceforth abandon that name. The name Aztec gained popularity in the 19th century, thanks to an American historian who wanted to demarcate the people of Mexico, drawing a line between those pre-Columbian societies and those after the Spanish conquest. There were many conquests before the Spanish arrived in Mexico, and the winners of each of them often rewrote history in their own favor. This makes a clear understanding of the history of the Mexica difficult, but thanks to the magnificent material ruins left by the Aztec as well as the oral accounts taken down by those Spanish conquerors who were interested in documenting the culture they almost destroyed, much is known 500 years later.
The important myth for the Aztecs was this migration myth, where they left their mythic homeland of Aztlan from a place called Chicomostac, or the place of the seven caves.
The Aztec people were filled with supernatural and mythological tales. Elders spoke of a magical and rich city with splendid palaces that existed right here on Earth. The city was called Teotihuacan, the place where men became gods. These pyramids and ruins are what remains of this once majestic city. In the 4th and 5th centuries, the 6th largest city in the world. When the Aztecs lived, the place was abandoned, partially swallowed up by the jungle. But the Aztecs still believed that the incredible pyramids were built by the gods thousands of years earlier, and they made pilgrimages to the site. Archaeologists found that the city of Teotihuacan was established in 200 BC by the peoples of the Mexico Valley. The pyramids, some of the most extraordinary monuments in the Americas, were built around 200 AD. At its zenith, Teotihuacan had grown to cover an area of almost 8 square miles and had almost 200,000 inhabitants. The monumental complex lies in the high Anahuac Valley in a barren and arid landscape that heightens its magical and mysterious atmosphere. The most imposing sight, however, is in the Plaza del Sol. Along with the ruins of an altar and several temples stands the Pyramid of the Sun. 230 feet tall, 740 feet long on each side of the base, it is almost as big as the Egyptian Pyramid of Cheops at Giza, one of the 7 wonders of the world. From here you can also see the other great pyramid of Teotihuacan, the Pyramid of the Moon. Smaller than the Sun Pyramid, it's 130 feet high, with a square base measuring 460 feet on each side. Yet despite these structures that have seemed to last an eternity, no one has figured out why the city and the culture disappeared so suddenly.
In fact, modern-day Mexico City is on top of that lake.
The city of Tenochtitlan is founded in 1325. And the city is a planned city. The Spanish, who conquered it 2 centuries later, were awed by the incredible planning. They saw canals, they saw 4 major causeways going through the city, meeting at the center point.
These were built to accommodate heavy traffic, and were so wide that the Spanish noted you could fit 10 horses side by side. Along each of these major highways were located many of the larger city buildings, with a series of gates and drawbridges located at the entrances to the city. Co-located with the causeways were also aqueducts, which brought in fresh water from springs on the mainland.
Now, an ample food supply for civilians is a no-brainer in the critical development of any civilization. But the Aztecs perfected a unique method, not only to provide a substantial food supply for its civilian populace, but to fuel the military expansion of its empire.
This revolutionary engineering was called chinampas, a system that allowed them to literally create new land to farm and to live on.
Basically, Chinampa is an artificial island built in the lake.
They look like narrow football fields, about 300 feet long by about 30 feet wide. A chinampa was built by weaving a web of sticks floating in the water and piling reeds on top of them. Mud was then scraped from the lake bottom and piled atop the reeds to form the chinampa. It took 4 to 6 men 8 days to build the average chinampa. They were connected to the city by massive navigational canals that would take thousands of men months to build.
A chinampa like this one could produce up to 7 crops a year, whereas a farm on the mainland could yield 1, maybe 2, maybe 3 at the most.
From the many relics that have now been discovered, scientists are able to imagine how the magnificent ancient capital might have looked. The center of Tenochtitlan, situated between the cathedral and the Palacio Nacional on the Grand Plaza of the Zocalo, was mainly a place of worship, full of temples erected on the tops of pyramids with their characteristic steep stairways and colorful wall paintings. The city, at an elevation of over 6,500 feet, was surrounded by the lake, hills, and mountains. It was connected to the mainland by many causeways and interlaced with navigable canals. The ceremonial center, Teocalli, had many temples dedicated to important gods. The most imposing was the Templo Mayor, the religious heart of Tenochtitlan, the destination for pilgrims and home for priests and divinities. Only priests were allowed to climb to the top of the pyramid and enter the 2 temples. On either side of the temple, there were 2 other sacred constructions dedicated to the gods Quetzalcoatl and Tezcatlipoca. Teocalli also had dwellings reserved for those in the priesthood and playing fields for an Aztec ball game, which had more of a spiritual meaning than a sporting one. The players were the priests themselves. And lastly, there was the famous Altar of the Skulls, the Zompantli, where the craniums of human sacrifice victims were displayed.
A row of vertical posts connected by crossbeams, threaded with human skulls, flanked on each side by towers of skulls and mortar. The Mexica, the founders of Tenochtitlan, and one cultural group that comprised the Aztecs, thought human sacrifices would feed the gods and ensure the continued existence of the world. 35 meters long, about 14 meters wide, and an estimated 4 to 5 meters tall. Human sacrifice and even zompantlis were relatively common in many Mesoamerican cultures.
The Aztecs, a kingdom governed by the ideas of war and sacrifice. Before the arrival of the Spanish conquistadors, this nation would create one of the greatest empires in Central America. held together by a strong army and a fierce warrior culture permeating nearly every aspect of society. Many warrior societies have existed throughout history, but the Aztecs are quite special in comparison. Peace as a philosophical, religious, or political ideology did not exist in Aztec culture. They did not have any god of peace, rites for peace, and lacked any ritual cleansing for the readmission of soldiers into peaceful society. Conquest and the capture of enemy soldiers was the Aztecs' primary political goal, and war as its necessary handmaiden was suitably exalted. As a result, the Aztecs seldom entered into mutual alliances with other city-states, and generally regarded other states as either targets for conquests or as subjects. All Aztec men would be trained for combat, and death in war was the most honored status one could attain. An Aztec warrior was trained from an early age. On his 4th birthday, he was given an arrow and a shield, and when he became adolescent, he was sent to a warrior school known as the Telpocali. At the school, the boys were trained to blindly follow orders, and to fight with swords, spears, bows, and other weapons. Outside learning how to fight, the students were also obliged to do community service, which could take the form of sweeping the streets of the capital, or to work in agriculture. The conditions in the military school were intentionally harsh, to make the students tough and to create a feeling of unity among them. Already during his education, the young students were taken to the battlefield to help carrying weapons and supplies for the army. And when he reached the age of 20, he was considered a full-fledged Aztec warrior, ready to partake in battle.
Many of the city-states that would become a part of the Aztec Empire were founded at the beginning of the 12th century. The beginning of the late Aztec era is usually associated with the founding of Mexico Tenochtitlan in 1325. However, the Aztec Empire is best understood as a political alliance between some 50 or more city-states that occupied the Valley of Mexico. The primary political foundation that bound them was a system of taxes and tributes designed to raise the status of the sovereigns and the nobility, ultimately oppressing and pacifying the commoners. The golden age of the Aztec Empire began in 1428 with the formation of the Triple Alliance between Mexico Tenochtitlan, Texcoco, and Tlacopan.
We're talking about the center of a vast empire with subordinate cities that paid tribute to the Aztecs.